In the autumn of 1987, Sarah and Michael Chen disappeared without a trace on what should have been a simple weekend hiking trip through the Cascade Mountains. Their car was found parked at the trailhead, keys still in the ignition, their tent pitched perfectly at the designated campsite. But the couple themselves had vanished as if the mountain had swallowed them whole. For 36 years, their family searched. For 36 years, the forest kept its secrets. Until a drought exposed what the wilderness had hidden all along. If you're fascinated by mysteries that refuse to stay buried, subscribe and join us as we uncover the truth behind one of the Pacific Northwest's most haunting disappearances. The last photograph of Sarah and Michael Chen showed them standing at the base of Thornwood Ridge, their faces bright with anticipation. Sarah's dark hair was pulled back in a ponytail, and Michael had his arm around her shoulders. Both wore new hiking boots and carried matching blue backpacks. They looked young, in love, and completely unprepared for what the mountain had in store. Eleanor Chen kept that photograph on her mantle for 36 years. She dusted the frame every Sunday, careful not to smudge the glass that separated her from the last moment her daughter had been truly, verifiably alive. In the photo, Sarah was 28 years old, a kindergarten teacher with a laugh that could fill a room. Michael was 30, an architect who sketched buildings in the margins of newspapers. They had been married for 2 years. Eleanor was 73 now, and her hands shook more than they used to. But every October, when the leaves turned the same golden color they had been that weekend in 1987, she would take out the search maps and trace the trails with her finger, following the same paths she had walked countless times in those first desperate months after the disappearance. The police had called it an accident, a tragic case of inexperienced hikers underestimating the terrain. The search teams had scoured 30 square miles of wilderness, found nothing, and eventually, quietly, given up. The case grew cold. Life moved on. Eleanor's husband passed away. Her son moved to California. The world forgot about Sarah and Michael Chen. But Eleanor never forgot, and the mountain never forgot either. Some secrets don't stay buried forever. Some truths wait in the dark, patient as stone, until the right moment comes to claw their way back into the light. The ranger's voice crackled through the phone with an urgency that made Eleanor's chest tighten. She pressed the receiver harder against her ear, her other hand gripping the kitchen counter for support. "Mrs. Chen, this is Ranger Thomas Whitmore from the Cascade District. I need you to sit down." Eleanor was already sitting. She had been sitting in the same chair, at the same table, drinking the same brand of tea she'd drunk for 3 decades. The morning light came through the window at the same angle it always did. "I'm sitting," she said, though her voice came out smaller than she intended. "We've found something at Thornwood Ridge. The drought this summer lowered the water level in several areas, and there's a ravine that's been exposed. A hiker reported seeing what looked like camping equipment wedged in the rocks about 40 feet down." Eleanor's hand began to shake. Tea sloshed over the rim of her cup and pooled on the table's surface, but she didn't move to wipe it up. "Camping equipment," she repeated. "Yes, ma'am. We've recovered a tent, 2 backpacks, and some personal items. The serial numbers on one of the backpacks match the description from the missing persons report filed in 1987. He paused, and Eleanor could hear wind in the background, the rustle of trees. "Mrs. Chen, one of the backpacks has a name tag. It says Sarah Chen." The kitchen tilted. Eleanor closed her eyes and counted to 5 the way her therapist had taught her decades ago. When she opened them, the room had steadied, but nothing else had. "I'm sending someone to pick you up," Ranger Whitmore continued. "Detective Maria Santos from the county sheriff's office will be there within the hour. She'll bring you up to the site if you feel up to it." "I'll be ready," Eleanor said. After she hung up, she sat very still. The tea grew cold. The sunlight shifted across the floor. Somewhere in the house, a clock ticked away seconds that suddenly felt heavy with meaning. She thought about all the years she had prayed for this moment, for any sign, any answer. She thought about all the ways she had imagined it would feel. She had not imagined this hollow sensation in her chest, as if her heart had become a cave where sound echoed but nothing lived. Eleanor rose slowly and walked to the mantel. She picked up the photograph of Sarah and Michael, studied their smiling faces through the glass that had grown slightly cloudy with age. "I'm coming," she whispered to her daughter's image. "I'm finally coming." By the time Detective Santos's car pulled into the driveway, Eleanor had changed into sturdy shoes and a warm jacket. She had filled a thermos with water and packed tissues in her pocket. She had done all the practical things that needed doing, moving through her house like a ghost preparing for a journey it had always known it would have to make. Detective Santos was younger than Eleanor had expected, perhaps 40, with short dark hair and eyes that had seen enough tragedy to recognize it in others. She shook Eleanor's hand gently and opened the car door without asking unnecessary questions. They drove north in silence. The city gave way to suburbs, then to farmland, and finally to the dense forests that climbed the foothills of the Cascades. Eleanor watched the trees thicken outside her window, their trunks pressing closer to the road until the sunlight came through in fragmented pieces, dappled and uncertain. "The area where we found the equipment is off the main trail," Detective Santos said eventually. "About 2 miles from where your daughter and son-in-law pitched their tent. The ravine wasn't visible in '87 because it was full of runoff water. It looked like solid ground covered with brush." "They fell," Eleanor said. "It wasn't a question. We don't know yet. The recovery team is still working, but Mrs. Chen, I need to prepare you. We've found remains." Eleanor had known, of course. Some part of her had always known. But hearing the words spoken aloud made it real in a way that 36 years of absence never had. "Both of them?" she asked. Detective Santos's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "We're still excavating the site. The bones are badly degraded. It's going to take time to process everything." They turned onto a logging road that wound up into the mountains. The pavement ended and gave way to gravel, then to dirt packed hard by decades of seasonal rains. The car climbed higher, and Eleanor felt the pressure building in her ears, or perhaps in her skull, or perhaps in the place where grief had lived so long it had become part of her skeleton. When they finally stopped, there were 3 other vehicles already parked in a small clearing. A trail marker pointed toward Thornwood Ridge. Eleanor remembered this place. She had stood in this exact spot in November of 1987, calling her daughter's name until her voice gave out. Ranger Whitmore was waiting at the trailhead, a tall man with weathered skin and kind eyes. He nodded to Detective Santos and turned to Eleanor with an expression that held both sympathy and something else. Something Eleanor couldn't quite identify. "Mrs. Chen," he said, "thank you for coming. I know this isn't easy." "Show me," Eleanor replied. The path to the ravine was steep and narrow, carved through Douglas firs that rose like cathedral pillars into the gray October sky. Eleanor's legs remembered this terrain even after all these years, the way her feet found purchase on the uneven ground, the rhythm of breath and step that hiking required. Detective Santos walked ahead of her, and Ranger Whitmore followed behind, close enough to catch her if she stumbled, but far enough back to grant her dignity. 20 minutes into the hike, the trail opened onto a rocky outcropping. Below, Eleanor could see the ravine, a gash in the earth about 15 feet wide and impossibly deep. A team of people in official vests worked among the rocks, some photographing, others carefully placing items into evidence bags. Yellow tape marked off a large perimeter, and a portable shelter had been erected over part of the site. "We'll need to go down carefully," Ranger Whitmore said. "There's a rope system set up." Eleanor approached the edge and looked down. The ravine walls were nearly vertical, composed of dark stone slick with moisture despite the drought. At the bottom, perhaps 50 feet below, she could see the camping equipment spread out on the rocks like pieces of a broken puzzle. A blue backpack, faded to almost gray. The remnants of a tent, shredded by time and weather. And there, partially covered by a tarp, something that made her breath catch. Bones, pale against the dark rock. Detective Santos touched her arm gently. "Mrs. Chen, you don't have to go down there. We can bring items up for you to identify." But Eleanor was already reaching for the rope. Her hands, which had shaken in her kitchen that morning, were steady now. She had waited 36 years for this. She would not wait any longer. The descent was slow and careful. Eleanor focused on the placement of each foot, the grip of each hand, the way the rope bit into her palms through her gloves. She did not look down until her feet touched the bottom and someone was there to steady her. The ravine smelled of damp earth and decay, a green, ancient smell that spoke of things returning to the soil. The air was cooler down here, trapped between the stone walls where sunlight rarely reached. Eleanor could hear water trickling somewhere nearby, a hidden stream that had worn away at the rock for centuries. A woman in a forensics vest approached, her face professional but not unkind. "I'm Dr. Patricia Moore, the forensic anthropologist. You must be Mrs. Chen." Eleanor nodded, unable to speak. She was staring at the backpack, at the name tag still visible despite the years. Sarah's handwriting, careful and neat the way she had made all her students write their names on their artwork. "We've documented everything in situ," Dr. Moore continued. "We're about to begin the recovery process, but before we do, I wanted to ask if you could identify any of these items." Eleanor moved closer. Besides the backpack and tent, there were other objects scattered among the rocks. A flashlight, its casing cracked. A water bottle. A rain jacket still partially stuffed into its pouch. And there, caught between two stones, something that made Eleanor's knees weaken. A small notebook with a red cover. "That's Michael's," she whispered. "He always carried it. He would sketch things, buildings he wanted to design." Detective Santos appeared beside her. "Mrs. Chen, did your daughter or son-in-law have any enemies? Anyone who might have wanted to harm them?" Eleanor turned to look at her, confused by the question. "It was an accident. They fell, didn't they?" Dr. Moore and Detective Santos exchanged a glance, and Eleanor felt something cold settle into her stomach. "Mrs. Chen," Dr. Moore said carefully, "we found the remains at the bottom of the ravine, but their positioning is unusual. The tent and camping equipment are here, but the bones were found approximately 20 feet away from the campsite, partially covered by rocks." "Covered," Eleanor repeated. "You mean buried?" "We can't be certain yet," Detective Santos said. "But there are some irregularities we need to investigate. The way the equipment is arranged, the location of the remains, certain damage to the bones that we need to examine more closely." Eleanor looked around the ravine with new eyes. The scattered equipment no longer seemed random but deliberate, as if someone had thrown it down after the fact. The tent, shredded and weathered, showed tears that could have been from time or from something more violent. "What are you saying?" Eleanor asked, though part of her already knew. Detective Santos met her eyes directly. "We're saying this might not have been an accident. We're treating this as a potential crime scene." The words hung in the cold air between them. Above, at the rim of the ravine, a crow called out, its voice harsh and mocking. Eleanor felt 36 years of grief shift inside her chest, transforming into something darker and heavier. All this time, she had been mourning an accident. All this time, she had blamed the mountain, the weather, simple bad luck. But if Detective Santos was right, if this was something else, then someone had taken her daughter from her. Someone had looked Sarah in the eyes and decided she should die. "I want to know everything," Eleanor said, her voice stronger now. "I want to know what happened to my daughter." Dr. Moore nodded. "We'll find out. But Mrs. Chen, you need to prepare yourself. Sometimes the truth is harder to bear than the unknown." Eleanor looked down at the bones partially visible beneath the tarp, at what remained of her daughter after 36 years in the dark. "I've been living with the unknown for more than half my life," she said. "I'll take the truth, no matter what it costs." The motel room smelled of industrial cleaner and old carpet. Eleanor sat on the edge of the bed, still wearing her jacket, staring at the evidence bag Detective Santos had allowed her to take. Inside was Michael's red notebook, sealed in plastic but visible enough that she could see the water-stained cover, the warped pages. They had spent 6 hours at the ravine. Dr. Moore's team had photographed every inch of the site, carefully mapped the location of each item, each bone fragment. Eleanor had watched them work with a strange detachment, as if she were observing someone else's tragedy from a great distance. It was only now, alone in this room that looked like every cheap motel room in America, that the reality began to sink through her skin and settle into her bones. Detective Santos had driven her here instead of back home. "We'll need you nearby for the next few days," she'd explained. "There will be more questions. The investigation is just beginning." Eleanor turned the evidence bag over in her hands. Through the plastic, she could see Michael's handwriting on the pages, the careful architectural sketches he'd loved to make. She remembered him sitting at their dinner table, drawing while Sarah corrected spelling tests, the two of them comfortable in their silence. A knock at the door startled her. When she opened it, Detective Santos stood in the hallway with 2 cups of coffee and a manila folder tucked under her arm. "May I come in?" Eleanor stepped aside. The detective set the coffee on the small table by the window and sat in one of the chairs. Eleanor took the other, leaving the bed untouched. Something about lying down felt like surrender. "We've completed the preliminary examination," Detective Santos began. "Dr. Moore wanted me to share some initial findings with you before we go any further." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Mrs. Chen, both your daughter and son-in-law died from blunt force trauma to the skull. The fracture patterns are consistent with being struck by a heavy object, not from a fall." Eleanor's coffee cup stopped halfway to her mouth. Struck. "The damage to the bones shows directionality. Someone hit them from behind, multiple times." Detective Santos opened the folder and removed several photographs, but she didn't show them to Eleanor yet. "There's more. We found rope fibers embedded in the soil near the remains. The bodies were bound before they were placed in the ravine." The room tilted slightly. Eleanor set her coffee down before she could spill it. "Placed? You mean they were killed somewhere else and moved?" "That's our working theory. The camping equipment appears to have been thrown down after, to stage the scene, make it look like they'd fallen or gotten lost." Detective Santos finally slid one photograph across the table. It showed the ravine from above, with markers indicating where each item had been found. "Notice how scattered everything is. It's not the pattern you'd see from an actual fall. It's too spread out, too deliberate." Eleanor studied the image. Even to her untrained eye, something looked wrong. The tent was on one side of the ravine, the backpacks on the other. The bodies had been found in the center, partially covered by loose rocks that Dr. Moore believed had been placed by hand. "Why would someone do this?" Eleanor asked. Sarah and Michael were good people. They didn't have enemies. Michael's business was successful. Sarah's students loved her. They were just ordinary people living ordinary lives. Detective Santos pulled out another photograph, this one showing Michael's red notebook open to a particular page. "We're going to need to dry out and preserve the notebook properly, but we were able to examine some of the pages. Most of it is architectural sketches, like you said, but there are entries from the weekend they disappeared. Michael was keeping notes about the trip." Eleanor leaned forward. Through the photograph, she could see Michael's handwriting, blurred by water damage, but still partially legible. "The last entry was made on Saturday evening," Detective Santos continued. "He wrote about setting up camp, about Sarah making dinner over the portable stove. And then he wrote something that concerns us." She pointed to a line near the bottom of the page. "He mentions meeting another hiker on the trail that afternoon, someone who offered to show them a shortcut to a better viewpoint." Eleanor's skin prickled. "Did he describe this person?" "Only that he seemed friendly and knowledgeable about the area. Michael notes that the man said he was a local, that he'd been hiking these mountains for years." Detective Santos closed the folder. "Mrs. Chen, in 1987, were you aware of your daughter or son-in-law having any unusual interactions in the weeks before the trip? Strange phone calls, someone following them, anything that seemed off?" Eleanor searched her memory, reaching back through 36 years to those last normal days before the world broke apart. She remembered Sarah calling from school, excited about the upcoming trip. She remembered Michael stopping by to borrow her father's camping lantern. She remembered waving goodbye to them as they loaded the car, Sarah laughing at something Michael said. But there was something else, something she'd forgotten until this moment. Sarah called me 2 days before the trip, Eleanor said slowly. She said something strange had happened at school. One of the parents had asked her detailed questions about where they were going hiking, what trails they planned to take. She thought it was odd because this parent had never shown much interest in talking to her before. Detective Santos pulled out a notepad. "Do you remember the name?" Eleanor closed her eyes, trying to pull the detail from the fog of decades. "Sarah mentioned it, but I can't— Wait. She said it was David someone. She joked that he was suddenly being friendly, asking if the trails were safe, if they'd be camping alone or if there would be other hikers around." "David someone," Detective Santos repeated, writing. "Did Sarah mention this parent's last name, or which student was his child?" "No. I told her he was probably just making conversation, being polite." Eleanor's voice cracked. "I told her not to worry about it." The detective reached across the table and touched Eleanor's hand briefly. "You couldn't have known. Nobody could have predicted this." But Eleanor was no longer listening. She was remembering Sarah's voice on the phone, the slight uncertainty in it when she'd said, "It just felt weird, Mom. The way he was asking, like he wanted to know we'd be alone out there." And Eleanor had dismissed it, had told her daughter she was overthinking things, that parents asked teachers questions all the time. "I need you to think carefully," Detective Santos said. "Is there anything else from that time? Any other detail, no matter how small?" Eleanor pressed her fingers against her temples. The motel room felt too small, the air too thick. After they disappeared, the police interviewed everyone, family, friends, people from their jobs. Did they talk to the parents from Sarah's school? "I'll need to review the original case file, but I can check." Detective Santos stood. "Get some rest. Tomorrow we're going to start re-interviewing people from 1987. Anyone who knew them, anyone who was in the area that weekend. This case may be 36 years old, but somebody knows what happened. And now that we know we're looking at a homicide, everything changes." After the detective left, Eleanor sat in the dark room and stared at the evidence bag containing Michael's notebook. Inside those water-damaged pages was her daughter's last day, written in her son-in-law's careful hand. Inside was the moment they met their killer, though Michael hadn't known it when he wrote those words. Someone friendly, someone local, someone who'd offered to help. Eleanor thought about evil disguised as kindness, about how predators learned to smile while they hunted. She thought about Sarah trusting that smile, following that helpful stranger toward what she believed was a beautiful view. The mountain hadn't swallowed them after all. Something far worse had. The county archives smelled of dust and old paper. Detective Santos led Eleanor down narrow aisles lined with filing cabinets and cardboard boxes, their footsteps echoing in the fluorescent-lit space. A clerk had pulled the original case file from 1987, and it now sat on a metal table in a small research room, the folder thick with reports and photographs that had once represented hope, then despair, then abandonment. Eleanor hadn't slept. She'd spent the night in that motel room staring at the ceiling, watching the headlights of passing cars sweep across the walls, thinking about Sarah's last phone call and the parent who'd asked too many questions. Detective Santos opened the file carefully, the old paper crackling. The lead investigator in 1987 was Detective Frank Mercer. He retired in 2003 and passed away in 2018, but his notes are thorough. She began laying out documents across the table. They interviewed 73 people, family members, colleagues, friends, other hikers who were in the area that weekend. Eleanor leaned over the table, scanning the witness statements. She recognized many of the names. Her own statement was there, along with her late husband's, Sarah's principal, Michael's business partner, the couple who'd camped 2 sites over from Sarah and Michael, who'd told police they'd seen the young couple eating breakfast Saturday morning but hadn't seen them after that. "Here," Detective Santos said, pulling out a specific section. Interviews with parents from Meadowbrook Elementary, where Sarah taught. There are 12 statements total. She spread them out. None of them are from anyone named David. Eleanor frowned. But Sarah specifically said, "I believe you, but either the original investigation missed him or he deliberately avoided being interviewed." Detective Santos picked up another document. "Look at this. The couple from the neighboring campsite, Tom and Linda Vickers. They mentioned seeing Sarah and Michael talking to another hiker Saturday afternoon. The description is vague. Male, average height, wearing a green jacket. They didn't think much of it at the time because hikers talk to each other all the time on the trails. Did they describe his face? No, they were too far away, and he was wearing a hat." Detective Santos pulled out a map marked with the search grid from 1987. The Vickers said they saw Sarah and Michael heading east on the trail with this man around 2 in the afternoon. That was the last confirmed sighting of them alive. Eleanor traced the trail line on the map with her finger. East would have taken them away from the main path, toward the more remote areas of the forest, toward the ravine where their bodies had been hidden. "What time did the Vickers report them missing?" Eleanor asked. "They didn't. The Vickers packed up and left Sunday morning, as planned. They assumed Sarah and Michael had done the same." Detective Santos flipped to another report. "You reported them missing on Monday evening when they didn't come home and didn't call. By the time the search started Tuesday morning, almost 48 hours had passed since they were last seen. 48 hours for a killer to cover his tracks, to hide the bodies, to scatter the evidence and disappear back into his normal life." A staff member entered the room pushing a cart with 3 additional boxes. "These are the supplementary materials," she said. "Photos from the search, personal effects that were logged, news clippings." After she left, Eleanor and Detective Santos began sorting through the contents. There were photographs of the search teams combing through the forest, of the campsite that had been found intact but empty, of Sarah and Michael's car still parked at the trailhead. There were evidence bags containing items from their tent, a camping stove, Sarah's extra jacket, the book she'd been reading. Eleanor picked up a photograph of Sarah's classroom, taken by the police during their investigation. 20 small desks arranged in neat rows, alphabet posters on the walls, student artwork displayed on a bulletin board, Sarah's desk in the corner with a mug full of pens and a framed photo of Michael. "Can we find out who was in her class that year?" Eleanor asked. "If this David person had a child in Sarah's class, there must be records." Detective Santos nodded slowly. "School records from 1987 might still exist, but they'll be archived. It could take a few days to access them." She paused. "But there's another angle we can pursue. The school district would have required background checks for any parent volunteers or field trip chaperones. If this David was involved with the school in any official capacity, there would be paperwork." They spent another 2 hours examining the file, but there were no more revelations hidden in the old reports. The investigation had been competent, but ultimately unsuccessful, hampered by the assumption that the couple had gotten lost or fallen to their deaths. No one had been looking for evidence of foul play because the campsite had seemed undisturbed, and there were no witnesses to suggest violence. It was nearly noon when Detective Santos's phone rang. She answered, listened, and her expression grew grave. "We're on our way," she said, then turned to Eleanor. "Dr. Moore has completed the preliminary analysis of the remains. She wants us at the medical examiner's office." The drive took 40 minutes. Eleanor watched the landscape pass, trying to reconcile the beauty of the autumn forest with the horror it had concealed. The trees were innocent, she reminded herself. The mountain was innocent. Only people were capable of the kind of evil that had taken her daughter. Dr. Moore met them in a sterile conference room that smelled of antiseptic. On the table were several photographs and a thick report. The forensic anthropologist looked tired, as if she'd been working through the night. "I wanted to show you this in person," she said, directing their attention to a particular photograph. It showed a skull, cleaned and positioned for analysis. Even Eleanor, with no medical training, could see the damage. A large fracture across the back, splintered bone, the unmistakable mark of violence. Both victims were struck from behind, Dr. Moore explained. The weapon was likely a heavy, blunt object. A rock, possibly, or a piece of wood. The strikes were forceful and repeated. This was not a momentary act of rage. This was sustained, deliberate killing. Eleanor gripped the edge of the table. She had known, intellectually, that her daughter had been murdered. But seeing the evidence of that violence, the physical proof of Sarah's last terrible moments, made it real in a way that hollowed her out from the inside. "There's something else," Dr. Moore continued. "We found trace evidence in the soil samples from around the remains. Synthetic fibers that don't match the clothing or equipment belonging to the victims. These fibers are consistent with rope manufactured in the mid-1980s, used commonly for climbing or securing loads." "The rope that bound them," Detective Santos said. "Yes, but here's what's interesting. The rope was removed before the bodies were placed in the ravine. The killer took it with him, but microscopic fibers remained embedded in the surrounding soil." Dr. Moore pulled out another image, this one a microscopic view of blue synthetic fibers. "These fibers are from a specific type of rope, polyester blend, 3-strand twisted construction, with a distinctive dye pattern. It was sold primarily through outdoor supply stores in the Pacific Northwest during that time period." Detective Santos leaned forward. "So we're looking for someone who had access to climbing rope, who was familiar enough with the area to know about the ravine, and who had some connection to Sarah Chen before the trip." "There's one more thing," Dr. Moore said quietly. She pulled out a final photograph, this one showing a small bone, delicate and separate from the rest. "We found this approximately 5 feet from the other remains. It's a finger bone. The positioning suggests it was deliberately severed post-mortem." The room fell silent. Eleanor stared at the image, her mind struggling to comprehend what she was seeing. "He took a trophy," Detective Santos said, her voice flat with disgust. Dr. Moore nodded. "The cut marks on the bone are consistent with a sharp blade. This was done carefully, intentionally. Whoever killed Sarah and Michael Chen didn't just murder them. He wanted something to remember them by." Eleanor rose abruptly and walked to the corner of the room. She pressed her forehead against the cool wall and focused on breathing, on not allowing the horror to overwhelm her completely. Behind her, she could hear Detective Santos and Dr. Moore speaking in low voices, discussing serial killer profiles and psychological indicators. A trophy. Someone had murdered her daughter and taken a piece of her as a souvenir. The question that had haunted Eleanor for 36 years had finally been answered. Now she faced a new question, one that was somehow worse. What kind of person could do such a thing? And where was he now? Eleanor returned to Meadowbrook Elementary for the first time in 3 decades on a gray Wednesday morning. The building had been renovated since 1987. The brick facade repainted, new windows installed, but the basic structure remained the same. She stood in the parking lot for several minutes, gathering her courage, remembering all the times she'd visited Sarah here, watching her daughter light up when talking about her students. Detective Santos waited beside her, patient and quiet. They were here to meet with the school administrator, who had promised to help locate class records from that year. Inside, the hallway smelled of floor wax and children's art supplies, unchanged despite the decades. Eleanor followed a staff member to the main office, where a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and graying hair stood to greet them. "Mrs. Chen, I'm Patricia Hoffman, the district records coordinator. I'm so sorry for your loss." She gestured to a table where several file boxes sat. "I pulled everything we have from the 1986-87 school year. Sarah's class roster, parent volunteer forms, field trip permissions, everything." Eleanor approached the table slowly. These boxes contained the mundane paperwork of her daughter's last year of life. Attendance sheets, progress reports, permission slips signed by parents who had no idea their teacher would be dead within months. Detective Santos began examining the class roster. 22 students, their names listed with parent contact information. She ran her finger down the list, checking each father's first name. "I see 3 Davids here," she said. "David Morrison, father of Emma Morrison, David Yee, father of Justin Yee, and David Palmer, father of Kelsey Palmer." Patricia pulled up digital records on her computer. "Let me check our current database. These families might have had other children go through the district." She typed for several minutes, her expression growing more focused. David Morrison's family moved to Oregon in 1989. David Yee passed away in 2004. And David Palmer, she paused, clicking through screens. David Palmer's last known address is still local. His daughter Kelsey graduated from here in 1999. Eleanor felt her pulse quicken. "Do you have any notes about his involvement with the school?" Patricia printed several documents. He volunteered for the Fall Festival in September 1986 and chaperoned one field trip in October to the Science Museum. She looked up. The field trip was on October 9th, 1987, 3 days before your daughter disappeared. Detective Santos pulled out her notepad. "Do you have a photo from that field trip?" Patricia searched through the boxes and withdrew a manila envelope containing photographs. She spread them across the table. Children posed in front of museum exhibits, their faces bright with curiosity. Sarah stood among them, smiling. And there, in the background of one photo, was a man, tall, thin build, dark hair, wearing a green jacket. Eleanor's breath caught. "That's the jacket." The couple at the campground said the man they saw was wearing a green jacket. Detective Santos held the photo closer. The man's face was partially turned away, but his profile was visible. Late 30s or early 40s, with sharp features and glasses. "Is this David Palmer?" she asked Patricia. "I would need to verify, but based on the date and location, it's likely." Patricia returned to her computer. "Let me pull up his volunteer application." She found the file and opened it. The document included a photocopy of his driver's license from 1986. The face matched. Detective Santos photographed the documents with her phone. "I need his current address and any other information you have." As Patricia compiled the information, Eleanor stared at the field trip photo. David Palmer stood slightly apart from the other parents, his posture odd, his attention not on the children, but on Sarah. Even in this grainy image from decades ago, something about his focus seemed wrong, too intense, predatory. "He was watching her," Eleanor whispered. Even then, he was watching. Detective Santos touched her arm gently. "We don't know anything for certain yet. We need to investigate carefully." But Eleanor knew. Some instinct that had been dormant for 36 years now screamed with certainty. This was the man. This was the person who had smiled and offered help and led her daughter to her death. 20 minutes later, they sat in the car outside David Palmer's registered address, a modest house in a quiet neighborhood. The yard was well maintained. A newer model sedan sat in the driveway, and nothing about the property suggested anything sinister. "I'm going to knock on the door," Detective Santos said. "You need to stay here." "No." Eleanor's voice was firm. "I'm coming with you. Mrs. Chen, I've waited 36 years. I'm not sitting in a car while you talk to the man who might have murdered my daughter." Detective Santos studied her face, then nodded slowly. "Stay behind me. Don't speak unless I indicate you should, and if anything feels wrong, you get back to the car immediately." They approached the front door together. Detective Santos rang the bell. Footsteps sounded inside, and then the door opened. The man who stood there was in his late 60s now, his dark hair gone gray, his face more lined than in the photograph. But Eleanor recognized him instantly. The sharp features, the way he held himself slightly back from the doorway, the calculating look in his eyes as he assessed them. "David Palmer." Detective Santos showed her badge. "I'm Detective Maria Santos with the County Sheriff's Office. I'd like to ask you a few questions about an incident from 1987. Something flickered across Palmer's face, there and gone so quickly Eleanor almost missed it. Recognition, and beneath it, the faintest trace of a smile. 1987, he said, his voice pleasant and unremarkable. "That's quite a long time ago." What incident are you referring to? The disappearance of Sarah and Michael Chen. They went missing on a hiking trip to Thornwood Ridge. You knew Sarah Chen. Your daughter was in her class. Palmer's expression remained carefully neutral, but his hands, Eleanor noticed, had tightened on the door frame. Oh yes, Mrs. Chen, lovely teacher. I was so sorry to hear about what happened. Such a tragedy. When was the last time you saw her? Detective Santos asked. Palmer appeared to think about this. At school, I suppose. When I picked up Kelsey. Maybe a few days before the accident? It wasn't an accident, Eleanor said, unable to stay silent any longer. We know what happened. We found their bodies. Palmer's eyes shifted to her, and for just a moment, the pleasant mask slipped. What Eleanor saw underneath made her blood freeze. It was emptiness, vast and cold and hungry. Then he smiled again, all warmth and sympathy. I don't understand. Are you suggesting something other than a hiking accident? That seems rather unlikely after all this time. Detective Santos stepped slightly forward, positioning herself between Eleanor and Palmer. We're investigating all possibilities. Where were you on the weekend of October 10th through 12th, 1987? I couldn't possibly remember. That was decades ago. Palmer's tone remained pleasant, but something had changed in his posture. He was alert now, watchful. If you have specific questions, perhaps I should contact my attorney. That's your right, Detective Santos said. But we'd appreciate your cooperation. This is a murder investigation, Mr. Palmer. The word murder hung in the air between them. Palmer's smile never wavered, but Eleanor saw his pupils dilate, saw the muscles in his jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. A murder investigation, he repeated softly. How fascinating. Well, Detective, as I said, I think I'll need to speak with my attorney before I say anything further. I'm sure you understand. He began to close the door, but Detective Santos placed her hand against it. We'll be in touch, Mr. Palmer. Very soon. The door closed with a quiet click. Eleanor and Detective Santos returned to the car in silence. Neither spoke until they'd driven several blocks away. He did it, Eleanor said, her voice shaking. You saw his face. He did it. Detective Santos gripped the steering wheel tightly. I saw, but seeing and proving are different things. He's going to lawyer up, and without physical evidence connecting him to the crime scene, we have a problem. The rope fibers were generic, sold at dozens of stores across the region. Unless we can find that specific rope in his possession, or find witnesses who can place him at Thornwood Ridge that weekend, we need more. She pulled over and turned to face Eleanor. But I believe you, and I'm going to build a case against him, piece by piece if I have to. He's had 36 years to feel safe. That ends now. The task force assembled 3 days later in a conference room at the county sheriff's office. Besides Detective Santos and Eleanor, there were 5 other people present. 2 additional detectives, Dr. Moore, a criminal psychologist named Dr. Raymond Price, and a cold case specialist who'd driven up from Portland. Detective Santos stood at the head of the table, photographs and documents spread before her. David Palmer has retained an attorney and refuses to speak with us, but we've been digging into his background and what we've found is disturbing. She pinned a photograph to the board behind her. David Palmer's driver's license photo from 1987. Then she added more photos, a timeline stretching across the wall. Palmer was born in 1949 in Seattle. His father was military, and the family moved frequently during his childhood. Palmer was a loner, according to old school records. He dropped out of community college in 1969 and worked various jobs: landscaping, construction, outdoor equipment stores. Detective Santos paused. In 1972, a woman named Jennifer Hartley disappeared while hiking near Mount Rainier. She was never found. She added Jennifer's photo to the board. Young, dark-haired, approximately the same age Sarah had been. Palmer lived 30 miles from the trailhead where Jennifer was last seen. He was working at an outdoor supply store at the time. She added another photo. In 1978, Carol and Dennis Wright disappeared during a camping trip in the Olympic National Forest. Again, never found. Palmer was living in that area, working as a freelance wilderness guide. The pattern was emerging, stark and terrible. Eleanor felt sick. After the rites, Palmer moved to the Cascades region. He married in 1980, had a daughter in 1981, divorced in 1992. His ex-wife lives in California now. I spoke with her yesterday. Detective Santos pulled out a notepad. She said he was obsessed with hiking, would disappear for days at a time. She also said he kept extensive journals about the trails, about people he encountered. When they divorced, he took all those journals with him. Dr. Price, the psychologist, leaned forward. This profile is consistent with an organized serial killer. Someone who plans meticulously, who chooses victims in isolated locations where bodies can be hidden. The trophy-taking behavior Dr. Moore identified is also consistent. These killers often keep mementos. Can we search his house? Eleanor asked. Those journals, we're working on a warrant, Detective Santos said. But it's complicated. We need probable cause, and right now all we have is circumstantial evidence and a pattern of being in the vicinity of disappearances. His attorney will fight it. The cold case specialist, a woman named Agent Reeves, spoke up. I ran Palmer through our database. We have 16 unsolved disappearances in Washington and Oregon between 1972 and 1995 that fit a similar pattern. Hikers, campers, people alone or in pairs in remote areas. All the disappearances occurred within a 100-mile radius of wherever Palmer was living at the time. 16. The number seemed impossible, monstrous. Eleanor thought about 16 families like hers, 16 sets of parents or children or siblings who'd spent decades wondering, hoping, grieving without answers. Has he killed since 1995? One of the other detectives asked. Not that we can find, Agent Reeves replied. Either he stopped, or he moved to a different hunting ground, or he got better at hiding bodies. She pulled up a map on her laptop. But here's what's interesting. In 1996, Palmer bought property in a remote area about 60 miles from here, 40 acres of forest with a small cabin, very isolated. Detective Santos added the property location to her map. We're getting satellite imagery now. If he buried bodies on his own property, we could have a mass grave site. Dr. Moore finished quietly. The room fell silent. Eleanor stared at the wall of photographs, at Sarah's face among them, at the other victims who might have fallen to the same predator. How many people had smiled at David Palmer, had accepted his offer of help, had followed him into the wilderness believing he was kind? I want to go to the property, Eleanor said. Everyone turned to look at her. Mrs. Chen, that's not possible. Detective Santos began. Once we get the warrant, how long will that take? Weeks? Months? Eleanor's voice was steady despite the emotion threatening to break through. Meanwhile, he knows you're investigating. He could be destroying evidence right now. If we contaminate a potential crime scene, we lose everything, Agent Reeves said gently. I understand your frustration, but we have to do this right. Eleanor understood the logic. But logic seemed irrelevant in the face of what she'd learned. Somewhere on that 40-acre property might be the answers 16 families had been seeking. Somewhere in that cabin might be journals describing what Palmer had done, trophies taken from people who'd trusted him. Dr. Price cleared his throat. There might be another approach. Palmer's psychological profile suggests narcissism combined with antisocial personality disorder. These individuals often believe they're smarter than law enforcement. They enjoy the game, the challenge. You want someone to talk to him, Detective Santos said. Try to get him to confess. Not confess, necessarily, but to engage. Someone he perceives as worthy of his attention. Dr. Price turned to Eleanor. Mrs. Chen, he knows who you are. You confronted him at his door. To his mind, you're part of his story now. He might be willing to speak with you to prove his superiority. Eleanor's heart hammered. You want me to wear a wire. It's risky, Detective Santos said immediately. If he suspects anything, I'll do it, Eleanor interrupted. Whatever it takes. They spent the next hour planning. Dr. Price coached Eleanor on what to say, how to appeal to Palmer's ego without arousing suspicion. The goal wasn't to get a confession, but to get him talking about the mountains, about Sarah, about hiking. Any detail he revealed could help them build their case. As the meeting broke up, Detective Santos pulled Eleanor aside. "Are you sure about this? Palmer is dangerous. Even in a public place, even with surveillance, there's risk." Eleanor thought about Sarah's last moments, about her daughter following Palmer into the forest, trusting him until it was too late to run. "I'm sure," she said. That evening, Eleanor sat in her motel room and practiced the script Dr. Price had given her. She stood before the mirror and spoke the words, trying to sound convincing, trying to channel 36 years of grief into something Palmer would find interesting rather than threatening. "Mr. Palmer, I need to understand what happened to my daughter. The police think it was murder, but I can't accept that without knowing why. You were the last person who saw her at school. You knew her. Please, help me understand." The words felt like ash in her mouth, but she repeated them until they sounded natural. She was asking a killer for help understanding murder. She was appealing to the humanity of someone who'd taken trophies from corpses. But if it brought Sarah justice, if it stopped Palmer from ever hurting anyone else, Eleanor would swallow every shred of her dignity and pride. Her phone rang. Detective Santos. "We got the warrant for Palmer's house. We're executing it tomorrow morning at 6 a.m. But Mrs. Chen, I need you to prepare yourself. If we find what I think we're going to find—" She trailed off. "I know," Eleanor said. "I'm ready." But as she lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, Eleanor wondered if anyone could truly be ready to see proof of such evil. Somewhere in David Palmer's house might be her daughter's finger bone, kept for 36 years like a souvenir. Somewhere might be journals describing Sarah's death in Palmer's own words. Tomorrow would bring answers. Eleanor just wasn't sure she could survive knowing them. Dawn broke cold and gray over David Palmer's house. Eleanor watched from Detective Santos's car as the tactical team assembled, their movements precise and efficient. They'd parked 3 houses down, close enough to see but far enough to stay clear of the operation. 6 police vehicles lined the quiet street, and neighbors were beginning to emerge from their homes, drawn by the unusual activity. At exactly 6 a.m., the team moved. Detective Santos spoke quietly into her radio, coordinating with the officers at Palmer's door. Eleanor heard the knock, heard the announcement, and then watched as the door opened and David Palmer was led out in handcuffs. He was dressed in pajamas and a robe, his gray hair disheveled, but his face held that same calculating expression Eleanor had seen days before. As officers guided him toward a patrol car, his eyes swept the street and found Eleanor sitting in the detective's vehicle. He smiled. It was a small smile, almost gentle, and it made Eleanor's skin crawl. Even now, caught and exposed, he seemed amused by the situation, as if the entire investigation were merely an interesting game he'd been playing and had now gracefully decided to lose. "Don't look at him," Detective Santos said. But Eleanor couldn't tear her eyes away. She needed to see this, needed to watch Palmer's freedom end, needed proof that he couldn't hurt anyone else. The patrol car pulled away with Palmer inside. Detective Santos received clearance through her radio, and they approached the house. The front door stood open, revealing a tidy living room with generic furniture and walls bare of personal photographs. Nothing about the space suggested the monster who lived here. Dr. Moore was already inside, directing her forensics team. Officers moved through rooms methodically, photographing everything before touching anything. Detective Santos led Eleanor to the kitchen, where they could observe without interfering. "We've found a locked room in the basement," an officer reported over the radio. "Bolt cutters going through now." Eleanor's heart hammered as they waited. Minutes stretched like hours. Then Detective Santos's radio crackled again. "You need to see this." They descended narrow wooden stairs into a finished basement. Most of it was ordinary. A TV, a couch, storage boxes along one wall. But at the far end was a heavy door, now hanging open, a broken padlock on the floor beside it. Dr. Moore stood in the doorway, her face pale. "Mrs. Chen, you shouldn't come in here." But Eleanor pushed forward. She'd come this far. She would see it through. The room beyond was perhaps 10 feet square, windowless, lit by a single overhead bulb. The walls were covered with maps, dozens of them, showing hiking trails throughout the Pacific Northwest. Locations were marked with small colored pins, red, blue, green, each color apparently signifying something different. But it was the shelves that made Eleanor's knees weaken. They lined 3 walls, and on them sat glass jars, each labeled with a date and location. Inside the jars were small bones, fingertips, rings, locks of hair. Trophies from victims, preserved carefully, catalogued methodically. Detective Santos caught Eleanor before she fell. "Get her outside," she ordered an officer. But Eleanor shook her head. "No, I need to find Sarah." Dr. Moore approached carefully, understanding in her eyes. She scanned the shelves and picked up a jar labeled October 1987, Thornwood Ridge. Inside was a small bone and a delicate silver ring with a blue stone. Eleanor recognized the ring immediately. She'd given it to Sarah for her 21st birthday. "That's hers," she whispered. The room suddenly felt airless. Eleanor counted the jars quickly, 38 of them stretching across the shelves. 38 victims over decades. 38 people who'd been reduced to specimens in a killer's collection. A detective called from another corner of the room. He'd found journals, stacks of them, each one filled with Palmer's careful handwriting. Dates, descriptions, detailed accounts of how he'd selected victims, how he'd gained their trust, how he'd killed them. "We have him," Detective Santos said quietly. "Physical evidence, documented confessions, everything we need." But Eleanor felt no triumph, no satisfaction. She looked at the jars, at the maps with their colored pins marking hunting grounds, at the journals that contained horrors she would never read. This room represented decades of evil that had operated undetected while people like her waited and grieved and hoped for answers that seemed impossible. Over the following hours, the forensics team cataloged everything. Each jar was photographed, each journal page scanned, each pin on each map documented. Detective Santos made calls to police departments across the region, coordinating with agencies that had unsolved cases matching Palmer's trophies. By afternoon, families were being notified. Parents who thought they'd never know what happened to their children. Siblings who'd spent lifetimes wondering. 38 families would finally have answers, though those answers would bring their own kind of agony. Eleanor sat in the backyard while the investigation continued inside. The space was neat and ordinary, with a small garden and a bird feeder. Nothing suggested that a serial killer had lived here, had tended these plants and filled this feeder while keeping human bones in his basement. Agent Reeves joined her, sitting on the grass beside Eleanor's chair. "We're organizing a search of his property in the mountains, the one he bought in 1996. Ground-penetrating radar suggests there are multiple burial sites." Eleanor nodded numbly. More victims, then. People who hadn't even made it onto Palmer's trophy shelf. "Mrs. Chen," Agent Reeves continued gently, "what you did, bringing this case back to life after 36 years, it gave all these other families something they'd lost. Hope, closure, justice." "I just wanted to find my daughter," Eleanor said. "You found a lot more than that. You found the truth." As evening approached, Detective Santos drove Eleanor back to her motel. The radio was full of news about the arrest, about the horror discovered in Palmer's basement. By tomorrow, it would be national news. The case would consume the media, and Eleanor would be asked to speak, to share her story, to become the face of the victims' families. But tonight, she sat in her room and held the evidence bag containing Sarah's ring. The silver had tarnished, and the blue stone was clouded, but it was still recognizable as the gift she'd given her daughter so many years ago. Sarah had been wearing this ring when she died. Palmer had taken it from her body and kept it all these years, preserved in glass like an insect specimen. Eleanor thought about evil's many faces. Palmer had seemed so ordinary, so helpful, so kind. He'd volunteered at schools and smiled at children and offered assistance to strangers. And beneath it all had been something vast and cold and hungry, something that had consumed 38 lives before finally being stopped. The mountain had kept its secrets for 36 years, but in the end, the truth had emerged from the dark, dragged into light by persistence and luck and the determination of one mother who refused to forget. Eleanor set the evidence bag aside and pulled out her phone. She had calls to make, to her son in California, to Sarah's old friends, to the people who'd loved her daughter and deserved to know that justice had finally come. Tomorrow there would be a trial to prepare for, victim impact statements to write, media interviews to navigate. Tomorrow the hard work of healing would begin. But tonight, Eleanor simply sat with her grief and her relief and her exhaustion. And she whispered to her daughter across the years, "I found you, sweetheart. I finally found you. You can rest now." 2 years later, Eleanor stood at the base of Thornwood Ridge on a clear October morning. The forest was ablaze with autumn color, gold and crimson and deep orange, the same colors that had painted these mountains the day Sarah and Michael disappeared 38 years ago. The trial had concluded 6 months earlier. David Palmer had been convicted on 38 counts of murder and sentenced to life without possibility of parole. He sat in a maximum security prison now, his hunting days over, his trophies cataloged as evidence in a storage facility where they would remain until legal proceedings finally concluded. Eleanor had testified, had read her victim impact statement in a courtroom packed with other families who'd lost loved ones to Palmer's decades